We begin today with pushback against the plan to house some migrants in federal prisons. Immigration Minister Mark Miller says the measure is for high-risk individuals who often have mental health issues and that detention is a last resort. But many human rights advocates are urging the government to reconsider. 85 local and international organizations have released an open letter today calling on the Liberals to immediately cancel their immigration detention plan and look at alternatives to detention through community-based organizations. Up until now, some migrants have been placed in provincial jails, but all provinces have agreed to end the practice. Allan Rock was one of those that signed the letter. He's a former Liberal Minister of Justice. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Catherine.
If a migrant is deemed high risk, for instance, they have suspected ties to organized crime in another country, what is wrong with housing them in a federal penitentiary?
Well, for one thing, the CBSA overuses detention. In the last 8 years, there have been 45,000 people detained, and many of them in provincial jails until the provinces, one by one, told the federal government they were going to end those agreements. So detention is overused. There are many community alternatives which allow CBSA to monitor migrants or asylum seekers in the community until their hearing. 90% of the 45,000 people who were detained for what's called flight risk, not because they're a risk to the public safety of Canada, but because the CBSA agent fears that they may not turn up for their hearing. Detention can be indefinite. There's no time limit. And if it happens when it happened in provincial jails, they were put into facilities with people who were accused or convicted of crime. So mixing an administrative process with the criminal justice system is wrong in principle. If there are those cases, and I say they're very rare, where someone does present on a rational analysis some threat to public safety, the Government of Canada has 3 holding centres in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia that can keep 400 people in medium security environment. They're already there and they can be used for that purpose.
Minister Miller has said that these detainees will be kept in separate housing from the prison population. Does that go some way towards satisfying your concerns?
Well, first of all, I'd like to know what he means by that. But secondly, if you're going into a federal penitentiary, even if they're constructing some kind of ATCO trailer beside the main building, we say that's wrong as a matter of principle. I mean, we like to think of Canada as a nation of refuge. And I can't think of anything more inconsistent with that than to greet an asylum seeker who arrives at our shores by saying, we're now going to take you to the federal penitentiary. And whether it's in a trailer beside the prison building or in the prison building itself, it seems to me that it's just the wrong response. And I mentioned that, you know, there are holding centers that are available for the purpose. In 2020, when we had the COVID phenomenon, because of the danger of spreading the infection, CBSA emptied the provincial jails. It stopped detaining people. And you know what? There was not a spike in crime. There was not a threat to public safety.
Those were extraordinary circumstances, though, we have to acknowledge. I mean, there was a pandemic. There was also an overall diminishment in crime at the time. I guess I just wonder how useful that is as a case.
I think it's indicative of the fact that we're overusing detention. We're seeing boogeymen under the bed and behind the door where they don't always exist. And I can see that there can be those cases of hardened criminals leaving gangs in Central America, coming to Canada, who may indeed pose a risk. Mm-hmm. I say 2 things about that. First of all, we already have the holding centers that are available.
Would it be appropriate to put a hardened criminal, as you put it, in a medium security holding center that is not intended to be for people with criminality?
They have the capacity to keep people segregated from the general population. And yes, I believe they do. And I think that the whole security concern is overstated. And detention almost seems to be the default position when it comes to CBSA, and I think that's wrong.
This is not just about criminality. If we look at the comments that Minister Miller made to our colleague at Radio Canada, Brigitte Bureau, he talked about, we should say, a very small number of circumstances, and we have seen the numbers declining over time. High-risk migrants with severe mental health problems, where he has talked about concern about public safety, so other migrants, the public at large, staff. What do you say to that argument?
I don't associate either federal prisons or provincial jails with places for treatment of mental health disorders. In fact, I say that's the last place should go if you had a mental health issue. And at the same time, there are community facilities. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have provided the Government of Canada with a list of 1,200 community facilities across Canada capable of receiving, supporting, tracking, supervising these individuals in the community until their hearing.
So help me understand that a little bit better. I mean, we're talking about halfway houses, shelters, what kinds of facilities are they?
We're talking about places in the community, often that involve members of the diaspora, so the same place where the migrant or asylum seeker is coming from, who track their movements, keep an eye on them, provide them with access to services like health services, make sure they have food and lodging. They're there to assist, and they're being underused. May I also say that, you know, CBSA is the only police force type organization in the country that does not have independent oversight and supervision. Well, that might change if legislation before Parliament is eventually adopted, but at the moment, there's no supervision of their activities.
Now, you have been making this argument, in essence, since this was sort of part of the budget, although, as our colleagues have noted, didn't get a lot of attention when the budget was initially tabled. And it is a moral argument you're making. In this open letter, the wording is about something that is inherently punitive and inconsistent with international human rights standards. As you have made this argument, are you getting any sense from any members of the government that they are hearing you, that there's any willingness to change position here?
Well, it's early yet. I have a great deal of respect for the three people we've written to, the PM, of course, but also Minister Miller and Minister LeBlanc, two remarkable people who I think have shown good judgment in their portfolios. I would hope that these arguments will be persuasive. I don't know.
Sounds like you hope they're listening right now.
I don't know, but I do know that I spent 10 years in the federal cabinet myself, and when I saw an argument that hit the mark, I paused, I looked at it carefully, and I asked my officials, how can we accommodate these concerns while still acting in the public interest? And I hope they do that.
Okay, you have talked about your own experience just now as a federal Liberal, and so I do want to ask you about one more thing before we let you go, because you are a prominent senior Liberal. You are undoubtedly aware of the low poll numbers and reports that other high-profile Liberals, Dominic LeBlanc just recently reported in the Globe and Mail, would have interest in becoming the Liberal leader if the job became open. How concerned are you by the current state of the Liberal Party?
It's always a matter of concern when you see those poll numbers, but at the same time, I have to believe, and maybe it's just because I am a Liberal, I have to believe that when people turn their attention to the ballot question, right now they're being asked whether they're tired of the personalities in office, and I guess a lot of people say, yeah, we are tired, it's time for a change. But when people turn their attention to the actual ballot question, what are the other parties saying about foreign policy? What are they saying about healthcare? What are they saying about funding of research or funding the CBC for that matter? I have to believe that Canadians will look very carefully before they choose what's on offer as an alternative. And they'll remember the very good things this government has done over the last 9 years.
But could there be a better messenger, I suppose, is the question at this moment, rather than the Prime Minister?
Well, that's up to the party to decide. And all I've heard from ministers is that they stand by the PM and they look forward to running with him. So that's
There's no heir apparent piquing your interest right now.
I think that the important thing is to support the PM as long as he's there. And it's a unified team that can win this election.
Allan Rock, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Catherine.
What are the politics around housing, quote, high-risk migrants? It's time to bring in the power panel. Michelle Cadario is a former Liberal campaign director. Lisa Raitt is a former Conservative cabinet minister. Brad Levine is former communications director of the NDP. And Rob Russo is the former CBC Parliamentary Bureau chief. Michelle, I'm going to start with you. This is an interesting dynamic because we saw the provinces moving away from holding migrants in jails. There was, I think, increasing public scrutiny. There was pressure around it. And now you have the federal government coming in and saying, in essence, it has to take over. What do you think of the move the federal government has made here?
Well, I think that it sounds to me like they've been backed into a bit of a corner. As you said, the provinces have all kind of receded from this territory, and that's who I believe that the federal government had kind of counted on. And let's also remember that, as I understand it, it's not every person who arrives at our shores. It's people who are deemed high risk. So potentially that there are people who no one can confirm their identity or figure out, where they're from, or there might be something that is flagged from their past. And as well, as I understand it, unfortunately, it's also people with some severe mental issues. And so it's a real, issue of how do you weigh public safety and balance that off against, the absolute fundamental human rights that Canada stands for and that we like to be known for around the world, and as a safe haven for people who are coming from distressed places. And so I think that, I'm sure that this is not something that they relish having to actually take over in terms of the federal government, but really there's no other, is there another option there? And can community centers or any kind of facilities within the community or in the public actually take the place when you're talking about high-risk individuals? And I think the government's unconvinced of that.
Lisa Reid, I'll bring you in there because Allan Rock and the other signatories, 85 of this open letter, say that there is another alternative, right? It's placements within the community. They point to the fact that what Canada has been doing on this front, putting people in prisons or jails when they come here as migrants, is not a widely it's not widely practiced in the Western world, sort of suggesting that Canada is out of step with its allies. Do you think that there is a world where the federal government could go ahead and do what Allan Rock and others have suggested?
I don't think so. And I'll tell you why. And I may be a little bit meta on all this, but if I were an issues manager in this government right now, I would be saying, for God's sake, Allan and Lloyd, can you cut me a break here? Do you really need to go on this right now? I mean, they're having difficulties as it is with respect to the international student visa file. They have a difficulty with a suspect in a murder investigation not having to go through a criminal check in order to get his student visa and bragging about it. The Conservatives have them on the ropes about that, hoping to figure out which minister said it right and which minister didn't say it right. And now we have two former Liberal cabinet ministers coming out and saying, yeah, by the way, all those people who are deemed to be a flight risk or a security issue or a safety problem, we want them just to be put out into the community. It's not going to play well. And then finally, add on to all that, we got a housing crisis. So priority on having spots for people to live is something that's top of mind for Canadians. It feels like a perfect storm for Liberals trying to manage all of these issues, because the Canadians, what they see is they see concerns about how many people are coming into the country, where they're going to live, and whether or not they're safe. And the three of these things come together to cause a real problem, I think, for the government.
Brad, let me ask you, though, I mean, on the other hand, they have these, in particular, two former high-ranking Liberals, but a host of NGOs as well, saying, well, this decision you're making doesn't sit right with us morally. It is the wrong choice. Do those, whether it's optics or just sort of the moral concerns, does that have to weigh in as well?
It could, and I think one of the it sounds very illiberal to go about and doing this, and I think that Mr. Rock and others who have signed on to this probably tug at the heartstrings of many of Trudeau's fans, even though that's a smaller number today than it was a few years ago. There's no question that they didn't want to deal with this. To Lisa's point, I completely agree. Cut us a break, guys. And that's why they buried it. It was on page 400 of the budget bill. The minister responsible for this, these two files, both the Minister of Immigration and the Minister of Public Safety, apparently haven't said anything, and they referred people to the Minister of Finance because it was in a finance document that is the budget, which it still hasn't passed yet. So just an incredible attempt to maybe bury this very difficult issue for the Liberals.
I do want to give credit where credit is due. Our excellent colleague at Radio-Canada, Brigitte Bureau, who was the first one to report on this, did get an interview with Immigration Minister Mark Miller, which is where we have some of the sense of where the government stands on this. Although you're right, Brad, we were declined 2 times today when we asked for an interview. But Rob, I wonder what you make of the politics and the policy at play here.
It's pretty quiet out there on Parliament Hill right now, but you don't have to listen very closely to hear the scuffling, shuffling sound of Liberals squirming in their seats. And if you try to touch them, you get a nasty electric shock as a result. This really is kind of counter to the Liberal brand, particularly when you talk about housing the mentally ill in prisons. It's not the effective treatment we think of when we think of the mentally ill. And it really seems to be totally off-brand. Look, there would seem to be some instances when this might be justified. If you have strong evidence that somebody who's committed a serious crime is unlikely to appear, or if there are outstanding charges or previous convictions of violent criminal offenses, that it might be justified then. Otherwise, it's going to be a very difficult one to try and justify apart from popular political sentiment now. And I think it's a really vivid illustration how the consensus on immigration and immigrants is fraying. And it's come undone in many ways because of the large numbers of people who have come in without providing adequate infrastructural support, hospitals, schools, all of that sort of thing. But it's a sign that the consensus on immigration that has existed in Canada for a long time is in danger. And it's a vivid example of the difference between the era of Mr. Rock and the era of Mr. Trudeau right now.
Michelle, I do wonder whether there is any room for nuance, I suppose, on this issue. I was struck in speaking to Allan Rock that he was talking about overusing detention, and he did seem to be suggesting, there are very particular cases, and Rob pointed to a few examples there, where this might still be applicable, where he would entertain the idea that this is reasonable. Is there room for the Liberals to move a bit on this file without sort of wholesale dumping the plan altogether?
Well, I think that you all, especially Lisa, have really laid out the cross pressures that are facing the government. And, there's always a bit time for nuance, but unfortunately it doesn't sound like the government is, on the front step trying to actually talk about it. And I'm sure that they are busy trying to define that, which is what they need to do. I'm not sure that given the current environment that they are going to throw this policy out, because there also does have to be some kind of a backstop, as I said. And this has been in place, albeit under a slightly different system, for quite some time now. So I think that the best thing they can do is actually step forward and speak to those nuances, speak to the instances that it's happening, the frequency of occurrence, and some of the other kinds of situations. And I think that, in a time of public safety being kind of, being pushed to the agenda more by Mr. Poilievre, I'm not sure that where the opposition externally is necessarily going to come from, though there might be some discomfort internally.
So, Lisa, when you talked about, for instance, those pressures, like that there's a housing crisis, I think we all acknowledge, anyone who's following politics right now, that those are very serious concerns. At the same time, when I look at the concerns that are playing out in this issue, you have some of the advocates saying, well, on the one hand, there are cases where the CBSA is saying, well, you don't have any family in Canada, so you're a flight risk, so we have to lock you up. Well, you do have family in Canada, so you're a flight risk, so we have to lock you up. I mean, surely in those sorts of situations, we don't want those people, if they are not truly a flight risk, to remain locked up because there's a housing crisis. I know that's not what you're suggesting, but I guess it brings me to that question of how to navigate the nuance of this.
I think what's going to end up happening, Catherine, to be honest, is that the majority of these detainees who are just a flight risk, as opposed to being a safety problem for Canadians, as opposed to not being able to figure out who they are because they can't track documents, the flight risks are no longer going to be deemed as somebody that they're going to have to hold. I think that's the only way in which for them to deal with it, quite frankly, because if the provinces have said they're not going to hold people, and if the federal government's getting a little bit nervous about whether or not they're going to use federal penitentiaries in order to do that, the easiest thing to do is just to turn a blind eye on the flight risk.
Brad, one of the questions I asked Allan Rock was about the extent to which he felt that this was getting some traction from the government. And I couldn't help but note that he said very many complimentary things about the Prime Minister and the two ministers with the file, which suggests to me that he is still in the process of making his appeal to them. I wonder if you just have any thoughts about these sorts of campaigns, when there's an attempt by civil society groups, former members of government, to win the government over on a difficult issue, and how likely those types of things are to succeed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, again, every party is going to be different, but I would imagine that they'd be respectful in the dialogue, and obviously these two former Liberal ministers would probably have no trouble getting an audience with the appropriate political staff. The problem I think that the Liberals would have is if they did cave in to the demands of the organizations that signed on and the former Liberal ministers, they would look soft on crime and they would look like they cave into former colleagues. And that's not a good look. They've got enough trouble, as we've kind of already hinted at, particularly on the crime file, on immigration, on a whole number of issues. This would just let people know, a high-profile issue, that people would think that they're just soft on crime. So it wouldn't be a good look. And I think they'd do themselves some favors to say, look, this is a policy that's really not changed. All we're doing is moving them from provincial facilities to federal facilities. In essence, the federal government's policy hasn't really changed, but the province's decisions to back out of the arrangements forced them to change the facilities. Make it as easy as possible. Don't make it about crime. Make it as simple to understand as possible, and go on the offense. For goodness sakes, don't hide when this policy comes out. Otherwise, people like us in the opposition will just keep hammering away at them, and they'll look soft.
Rob?
Most of those provinces that held these people were Conservative governments. They don't care how they look on this issue. The Liberal Party is the party of the Charter. You would hope that this measure would be Charter compliant. There are 2 or 3 things they can answer, questions they can answer. Who determines the extent of risk for someone being held? How long can they be held? And what are the avenues of appeal for people who get incarcerated this way? If they can answer those 3 questions, they should come close to Charter compliance.